What is going on, Sharp football family? It is your resident Swami of Konami, Hribar, and we are here on a Wednesday evening. Here to talk about football. Camps are open. It's football season. We're starting to feel like football to everybody. So I've actually brought someone that works in baseball on the show now. But no, I have a guest. If you're wondering, Ray's on vacation, so I have a guest on the show here. It is a good friend of mine, Mr. Edwin Porras from Fantasy Points. He works for the Twins now, I believe. It is the Twins, right, that you work for?
It is the Twins. It is.
That's what I thought. I need the Twins to lose some games here, being in Cleveland. It's the only chance they have to make the playoffs. But I'll pretend I'm a baseball fan for a little bit here. But what's going on, brother, man? How is my R rolling getting? Is it on the Caucasian level? Is it like a 1 to 10? What do you rank it?
No, on the scale from 1 to water is spicy, I think that you're getting there, man. You're like a 4 or 5. I think that you're 4 or 5. I think it's really good. No, I appreciate it.
Not to spin off of that because this isn't on the show sheet or anything, but I've seen you also talk about how America has jumped the shark on tacos. Can you lay out exactly though what has happened to the taco and what is? And listen, you got to like what you like. I'm not telling anyone to give back what they like what you like. But what is the proper taco?
So listen, like you said, you can like what you like, and that's fine. I have no issues with that. Here's the thing, though. You can't put any type of hamburger meat inside of a hard shell from the store, sprinkle some cheddar cheese on it, and call it a taco, okay? You can call it a half wrap. You can call it a fun, hard burrito, but you cannot call it a taco, okay? And I think, Rich, you actually have done a pretty good job. I think you sent some picture of tacos you were having. I mean, you know what the proper taco is, right? You have the double corn tortilla, right? A little carne asada, or you can even do like pork if you want el pastor, something like that. Like you can throw it on there, throw a little lime juice, cilantro, maybe some tomato, a little garnish with the beets, the sliced beets, and dude, perfect taco, right? But these monstrosities made of hamburger meat, store-bought cheese, and store-bought hard shells, I've had enough. I've had enough. Just don't call them tacos. I think that's really my stance.
Man, I love it, man. You got to lay it on the wall here. You said it's jumped the shark. We're turning food into everything here, and everyone's got like their own like food YouTube. Food YouTube has actually gone crazy. If you think fantasy football YouTube has gone wild, man. Food YouTube is another stratosphere right now. But you know what? I brought you on the show because it's always a great time of the year. We've got camps opening up. Fantasy football drafts are ramping up. We're starting to kind of see what players are on the PUP to start. And you are working on actually a special project that's covering injuries, some of kind of the do's and don'ts of things that we should be looking at from the injury-prone label, breaking down some injuries. Tell everyone about the project you're working on and let everyone know kind of where they can kind of find this project.
Yeah, man. So I'm super excited to do this. This has really been, honestly, this book that I'm putting together, which is going to be called the Injury-Prone Draft Guide. And the playbook is, first of all, how should you view injuries? Second of all, why should you view them that way? All right, with as much stats and data as you could have. Your audience specifically will probably find this extremely interesting. And then I've taken data from the last 5 years, and for the most common injuries, high ankles, concussions, shoulder issues for quarterbacks, and basically combined it into these charts so that for season-long players, and this is especially helpful for DFS and sports bettors, found the average and the median of what their performance looks like pre-injury versus post-injury. And we did that for every position except tight end, because if you have a tight end with the pulse and active on Sunday, you should probably start them. So the sample isn't big enough to really give us any actionable numbers. But that's really the project that it's been a long time coming. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, but I want to provide as much actionable, data-driven, I guess, just guide for sports bettors, for fantasy gamers, for anybody who's interested. And I have to find the link. I'm a straight stone cold boomer at the age of 30, so I need to find my pre-order link. I think
we're going to throw it in the YouTube and in the podcast, all the podcast information. Just check the info there, and we'll link you there.
That's perfect. And so, but I did. There is a discount code for your audience specifically. Sharp25, get 25% off pre-order. The book is dropping soon, but right now it's a pre-order link. So Sharp25. It'll be active for the next week. That's enough, man. I hate self-promoting. I want to move
Yeah,
on.
I'm terrible at it too. But I don't want to give away everything in the book, but there was a couple things I wanted to kind of talk some top down, like injury, kind of either, I don't know if we want to label them misnomers or myths, but some things that exist in the hierarchy. Because before this became like, people like you in this space, and Matthew Betts, we've had him on the show, excellent at his job as well. I used to always be someone that's just like, well, if the guy's hurt, I'm just not going to draft him. I don't have enough information. I'm not a doctor. But now that we've got more people like you in the space, we're able to get educated on the actual injuries. And we're able to make more calculated bets on players, see when guys are getting discounted. Maybe the public hasn't caught up to saying, like, well, this isn't as severe injury or not. So I'm really grateful that, you found your kind of lane in the space, and we're getting this analysis in, because I was someone that just kind of was like, well, if that guy's hurt, I don't know. I'm just not going to take him. But one of the guys that I've been kind of talking about this summer has been Lamar Jackson. And I've been talking about the transition the Ravens are making under Todd Monken. They're going to be more aggressive throwing the football. They're going to play at a higher pace. And one of the pushbacks I always get is like, well, that just means he's going to get hurt again, right? If Lamar's doing these things, he's dropping back, more than ever, and he's got more chances to scramble, then that just means he's going to be more prone to missing games like he has the last 2 years. But you've actually written something in the book that's talked about how not necessarily mobile quarterbacks are at as much risk, injury risk than you would assume compared to pocket passers. Is that correct?
That's correct, man. So really, if we look at it, Barrett, what is it? Brass taxes, like the brass taxes here. The data shows if we split quarterbacks, and I did the study earlier this offseason, if we split quarterbacks up to a group who runs either less than 2 or fewer times per game, that's design runs, that's scrambles, versus those who run 3 or more times per game, again, design runs or scrambles, the results were pretty crazy, right? So this is from 2018 through 2022. So right, this is the current era. That gave us a sample of 162 quarterbacks, right? So Lamar Jackson will be in there multiple times, but we also removed the Jeff Driscolls of the world, the Taysom Hills, like those kind of like fun suckers. Removed those guys completely out of the picture. Left us with 162 instances of quarterbacks, and we split it up just the way that I mentioned it. So the group that fell into the ran 2 or fewer times, the quarterbacks who ran 2 or fewer times per game, they missed 1.8 games due to injury. And the group who ran 3 times or more per game, they missed 1.6 games per season. I'm sorry, I think I said per injury earlier. It was per season. So essentially what we find is that even if you want to say that that's a wash, it's neutral. Mm-hmm. That is totally backwards and not at all what I think the general public, probably not your audience. Again, your audience is pretty sharp, would assume. And a lot of the mainstream narratives is, oh, they're running quarterback, they're going to get injured, they're going to get that. I mean, the interesting thing too, specifically about Lamar Jackson too, Rich, is that even though he is an outlier, I mean, all of his injuries have came in the pocket, right? Like it's his ankle issue. The ankle issue is in the pocket, right? The PCL was in the pocket. Like he hasn't gotten injured because of rushing in particular. So I think that's really interesting to note. And I think the other thing too is that, when we, in this specific study, I also looked at, okay, so like, what should we?
I think we lost Edwin here. I hope he was going to say something important, but we lost him. But yeah, so just digging in, I don't know exactly where he was going with that point. Hopefully we get him back here in a second. But, one of the biggest kind of misnomers is that these guys that run around get hurt. And I actually have a theory on why this happened. I could have pitched it to Edwin, if we get him back here, that, if I'm running the football, I'm kind of cognizant of what's going around with me, like either preparation for hits or kind of what my surroundings are, because my primary assignment is, carrying the football. When you're in the pocket, you either can hit your hand on a helmet or a player because you're trying to throw the football, make reads. You're not always able to see everything, and you have a peripheral sense of what's going on around you, and you can sense the pass rush, but you don't know when a guy's going to like roll up on your ankle and things like that, as opposed to being able to protect yourself, while you're running the football. Let's see, it'd be interesting if he, would shoot down that theory, but that's kind of what I've always thought, is that, if I'm a ball carrier, I know, when I'm going to get hit and whatnot. But yeah, one of the things I always get pushback on with Lamar Jackson in this year is that, he's going to, the time he's missed, and if he's going to have more opportunities to scramble and run more, then it's just going to be more of a myth. I definitely want to ask him about, running backs versus wide receivers and injuries. He's got that on here. Hopefully we get him back. What's funny is I'm actually in Cleveland, and it's like a huge thunderstorm going on here, and I'm not the one that dropped off. But I have no experience trying to extend time live on air and no hosting ability. But we could talk about some of the news here until we get Edwin that kind of happened in camp today, which is really very minimal. But, obviously we saw the 49ers. We're going to talk about Brock Purdy too, but the 49ers are claiming Brock Purdy's going to open as the QB1 in camp. There's still going to be a competition. He did not throw today because they said they're not going to have him throw consecutive days. So it was Trey Lance and Sam Darnold today. But that's one of the situations to kind of monitor. I think that the Brock Purdy situation is one of the most interesting in football because he was so good when he quarterbacked that small game sample last year. But we've seen so many quarterbacks in this Kyle Shanahan system have, moments of success in a small window where the system has carried them over their perceived talent. And Brock Purdy is a guy, 7th round draft pick. Maybe he is the next Tom Brady, right? But we still have a very small sample of him in the NFL, and we have a sample that's really not sustainable the way he did it. I mean, he had an 8.8% touchdown rate over the games that he played. Now, mind you, Patrick Mahomes led the NFL last season at 6.3%. So are we really buying that Brock Purdy is that much better than Patrick Mahomes? The other thing, too, is that we also had a very, small sample of him playing, but also not facing really strong defenses, especially defenses that could rush the passer. We saw him face one team that was above 15th in pressure rate for quarterbacks last year. And it's a bummer we didn't get to see him play in the NFC Championship game against the Eagles, because that would have been a great litmus test, because the one defense that he faced that was good at rushing the passer was the Cowboys the week prior to that, and he looked completely human and a different quarterback, and the 49ers had by far their worst offensive, production under Purdy in that game. I don't think that that's kind of a coincidence. So if we start to get a larger sample and we start to see teams get more pressure on him, because only 4 quarterbacks had a worse inaccuracy rate under pressure than Brock Purdy last season, of all 47 quarterbacks throw 100 or more passes. Is this a situation where it's Jimmy Garoppolo-esque, where it's like, yeah, against these soft defenses, this offense and the offense system is going to shred, right? We've seen it. Baseline quarterback play. We've seen it, from small samples with Nick Mullins. We saw it with Garoppolo. I mean, they made a Super Bowl with Garoppolo. They made an NFC Championship game with Garoppolo. So is it a situation where, Purdy turns into the same situation the 49ers have and they have to chase again? That's the reason why they drafted Trey Lance in the first place, because they didn't have a quarterback that was like top down, raw talent, had like the ceiling and upside. And it's what made them chase Trey Lance. And that's not me defending Trey Lance or going to bat for Trey Lance going forward. It's me saying what got them in the boat of taking Trey Lance. Is that going to happen again, right? And if we get a larger sample of Brock Purdy. We saw it with Brian Hoyer. We saw it with Nick Mullins. We saw it with CJ Beathard. We saw it with Garoppolo in this system. So I think it's pretty fragile to even bet on any 49ers quarterback starting all 17 games. Like, what kind of leash does Purdy get, even if he, outright is the starter? He earned the right to be the starter too in week 1. I don't want to take that away from him, but what's the leash look like? What if the 49ers are kind of stagnant and they're kind of pedestrian to open the year? Do we see kind of a hook? Do they even go to Darnold at some point? I think that those are all, very interesting, scenarios. A couple of things that we also saw, from today. Obviously, Bryce Young opened as the QB1 for the Panthers. That was obviously a no-brainer. We knew that was probably going to happen with Frank Reich. We're waiting on the Colts, right? We want to see what the Colts are going to do. Like, do they just go in with Anthony Richardson? We've seen Jim Irsay kind of make some commentary that he was going to be the starter sooner than later. So we're waiting on that situation. Let's see. The T's behind here tell me that, Stephon Diggs on the same page with Sean McDermott, wants to retire in Buffalo. I never bought anything about that, like, reading between the lines. Was it a Stephon Diggs versus Josh Allen thing? I think Diggs was a pretty passionate dude when it comes to being on the field. And I think there was some frustration at the end of the year because there was no help for Stephon Diggs. If you look as the season progressed, like, no one was stepping up for the Bills. Obviously, Gabe Davis, played injured, whether you want to attribute that to his ankle injury, but there was no alleviation for Stephon Diggs in the offense. And as the season progressed, we saw more and more teams devote more resources to not allowing Stephon Diggs to beat them. And you saw when you lose in the playoffs and you're a wide receiver and you have a subpar performance and you feel like you could do more, you're not getting targets, not just because the offense is being shut down, but because no one else is getting you free to get targets. It was a problem. So I think that he wanted them to do more around them, more than Dalton Kincaid, more than they've done necessarily this entire offseason. Adding Deontay Hardy and Trent Sherfield is not necessarily the answer. So I think Diggs really wanted them to add one of these other guys. Well, I don't know if how true that is. That was always my read on the situation, though, is that he wanted the Bills to more aggressively, pursue help for this passing game. But I never really bought it as like he had like a true schism with Josh Allen. I'm also not in the building. I don't really know if there's any, truth to that at all. But let's see, what else can we kind of fumble our way through? We got Kadarius Toney. Obviously I was going to save this. We were hopefully to talk to Edwin about Kadarius Toney and his litany of injuries since he entered the NFL. I think it's interesting because it does elevate a number of guys like Rashee Rice. Does he have more of a chance now to play in 2 wide receiver sets? We know Sky Moore always had a path to the slot role, right? Like we knew he was drafted to potentially take over for Juju Smith-Schuster. I have always thought that Rashee Rice was drafted in the same ilk of they were planning for him to take over for Marcus Valdes-Scantling after this year. So now with the injury to Toney, like on 2 wide receiver sets, does Sky Moore get elevated and play 2 wide receiver sets? Does Rashee Rice get elevated and play 2 wide receiver sets? This isn't a team that ran a lot of 3 wide receiver sets last year. It'll be interesting to see if they do run more this year. They feel more confident in their depth, but I'm not sure they necessarily do. Obviously, you lose McCole Hardman too this offseason. I expect them to still be more of a team that uses a lot of 2 tight ends, doesn't play a lot of 11 personnel. So who ends up being on the field for those 2 wide receiver sets is massive. I think Marcus Valdes-Scantling is going to be out there a lot more than people want. Like he's going to be out there exercising, getting his wind sprints in. So does Toney now open up a path for Rashee Rice to kind of open up in that role, or do they just more comfortable with the where Moore is in the system? And does he? So we're definitely trying to get that through beat reporters. Also, I can talk about too is kind of what to do with beat reports at this time of year. Obviously, I used to work for NBC and at Roto World. I didn't do a ton of blurbing, but some of the things you're looking for this time of the year is things that are actual reporting, right? Where is a player playing ahead of someone? The order of reps. Are they using him in certain packages, like in red zone packages? What you don't really care about is this guy looks good, right? Like those are the things you necessarily don't give a damn about, or like, stuff that just has like stuff like projections, like he's in great shape, things like that. You're looking for actual reporting this time of year. I see we've got Edwin back. Edwin, I tried my best to meander my way through those 8 minutes. It felt like 35 minutes for me.
I'm really sorry. I have no idea. So the power to my entire apartment just totally went out, and then the breakers flipped and we lost internet. I have no idea what's happening. I didn't know if it was the apocalypse or if the powers that be didn't want anybody discussing the injury rates of mobile quarterbacks. I don't know, but I'm really sorry that happened. That's never happened before, and I'm back now.
Nice. Well, we'll move on from there, though. One of the things in the book, too, that stems off of that, though, is you kind of talk about the myth of play style kind of doesn't matter, right? You hear this all the time. Like, this guy runs into contact, or he's too small, he's going to get hurt. There's really kind of no evidence, though, that body size and play style like leads to more injuries, though, right?
Yeah, no, there's no evidence that really supports that. Now, it's not a bad thought, and it would seem like common sense, right? You're smaller bodied, less muscle. You're going to get thrown around. You're at higher risk for specific types of injuries. But the bottom line is, like, these guys, just think of a guy like, I don't know, Drew Brees, right? He made it all the way. He was small, right? He was slight. He's not necessarily Bryce Young slight, but he did have at the end of his career some pretty significant injuries that maybe you could attribute to his size. So those are the types of things that you do have to consider. But when it comes to tight ends, when it comes to running backs, wide receivers, like, I think the narrative forms so quickly. And I think what happens is dudes are injured so frequently in the NFL that people start making associations. So like George Kittle is a perfect example. He's an example I use in the book for a long time. And people still say like, oh, George Kittle's injured all the time because look at the way, that he plays. Two of George Kittle's, 3 major injuries have come when he was a defenseless receiver or when he was blocking, right? Like I think it's just like narrative-y stuff like that just has no bearing on how often a player is injured. The other thing specifically for running backs is that there was no difference in this big study that was conducted in NFL running backs for a 10-year period. There was no difference in injury rates for guys that were between 29 and 33 BMI. So BMI, obviously just a combination of height and weight, sort of just a formula. There was no difference in those guys, right? So can we talk about the tail ends, right? The 28 and the 34 guys? No, we don't know, but we can assume that at some point, there probably is a measure of weight, like maybe 200 pounds that you want to reach to maybe be not as likely to get injured. But we don't have any data that specifically supports like, hey, if you're this size, there's this, X amount percentage that you're going to get injured. I think that's how fantasy managers, gamers should view players is what is their injury history? What is more likely to happen? And has this been an issue for them in the past? And a lot of times the answer is no.
Right on. I love that. Now we just need coaches to kind of get over like the archetypical stuff, like with not using running backs that are, sub 200 pounds in short yardage when there's kind of no evidence like those guys are worse successful at it too than falling in love with like a 240-pound guy that just can fall forward. That's the next thing we've got to breach as well. Let's talk about some individual player stuff, right? Like, because, I said drafts are ramping up. People are wondering how to like navigate this landscape. And when you look at the front of drafts, we do have a few guys that are very interesting this year coming off injury. One of the guys is Breece Hall, right? And if Breece Hall doesn't have his ACL injury, he's arguably he's in contention maybe for the RB1 overall, right? Like if Bijan Robinson is already like flirting with going ahead of Austin Eckler and does go ahead of Austin Eckler in a number of drafts, where would Breece Hall have been? Assuming he finished the season as strong as he had. I mean, he led all running backs in yards per touch on his small sample. He has the ACL injury. He has surgery in November. What are we looking at for Breece Hall in terms of expectation of when he will be, back on the field? When can we expect him to be 100%? Is he someone you're outright avoiding, or is there some optimism for Breece Hall?
I'm optimistic on Breece Hall. I actually put the numbers in here because I think it's worth writing out. So Breece Hall is coming back from what we assume, is a relatively straightforward ACL with minimal meniscus involvement. So in other words, he didn't have to have an LCL, right? Reconstructed. He didn't have a big meniscus issue. They really went in there and probably snipped it just based on some of the things that we know as PTs when, based on some of the things he was doing in certain timeframes. So Breece Hall, right? Let's zoom out real quick. What do we want, right? Because there have been studies on this that I've done, that other analysts have done, and that the medical community specifically has done on NFL players. What are you looking for when you want a 99th percentile outcome in the first year back from an ACL tear? Well, you want them to be 26 or younger at the time of the injury. Check. You want them to be exceptionally athletic. Breece Hall is 92% spork athlete. That spork is fantasy points, is a version of athleticism. You want a minimum of at least 9 months dedicated to rehab, and Breece Hall is going to be about 10 by the time week 1 rolls around. They need 4th round NFL draft capital or higher, and the higher the draft capital, the better. And then, like I mentioned before, a relatively straightforward procedure. Here are Breece Hall's numbers. 21 years old. He's actually 96th percentile spork athlete. Sorry. He's only 92nd in the 40-yard dash. He had 9.75 months to rehab. He was in 36th overall pick in the NFL draft, and his surgical procedure was relatively straightforward, right? So we have all of the makings for Breece Hall to have a breakout season. Now, can we guarantee injury? No, but another immediate argument is, compensation this, compensation that, right? So basically I went back and calculated how many running backs after an ACL since 2010 have actually had what we call, compensation injuries. And I hate to say it because I really don't like to be that guy, but a lot of them can be explained away. Danny Amendola, 31 years old. Darren Sproles, 32 years old. Dalvin Cook was a rookie at the time. He was already adjusting to workloads, and he had his ACL tear and then had issues after that. Saquon Barkley, it was a fluke ankle sprain. Like when you dig into the data on compensation injuries, you really don't find a lot of stickiness to the sample itself. And you have guys like Adrian Peterson, right? And even guys like Giovanni Bernard after an ACL who played every game, and Jamal Charles who played every game. Like, obviously we're looking for outliers because the more probable outcome for somebody that isn't in Breece Hall's situation specifically is that they have a down year, or honestly that they fall out of the league. It's like 53% of running backs actually fall out of the league after an ACL tear. So we are looking for the 1% outcome, right? But that's what we're looking for. We're finding edges. And I think that the third round, at some point, sometimes you're getting Breece in the back half of the third round. And to me, that's egregious. Now, obviously, a lot of that has to do with just that running backs this year are suppressed in general, especially on sites like Underdog. But I think that we are viewing Breece Hall and he's being drafted at his floor, when I really think his ceiling is he can be a top 12 pick next year.
Yeah, I think too, when you look at if there's going to be any slow start or ramp up period of Breece Hall too, like that's the worst of the Jet schedule. I mean, their pre-bye schedule is pretty rough, but if you're looking post-bye, things definitely get light. Things get better towards the end of the season too as well. There's some juicy matchups in there. I think Breece Hall fits like structurally a draft plan right now that's really sound, is that if you're in the front half of the draft and you open with one of these elite wide receivers, like a lot of people are doing, let's say, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, then you come back and you've already hit that wide receiver firewall, and like wide receivers have been pillaged, and you're kind of staring down that, the barrel of looking at like, oh, am I going to take, a T Higgins or a Devontae Smith versus a guy like, say, like Nick Chubb at that point. You can take one of those running backs that still profiles as an RB1, and then in the third round, take Breece Hall, and you've got an anchor running back. You've got potentially another RB1 for the crux of the season when he gets kind of ramped up. And then you just hammer wide receiver the rest of the way. And you can get a guy like a Jamal Williams or Samaj P. Ryan later on for like production early in the season. You maybe even get like a guy like Rashod Penny, right? For early season production while you're just trying to bridge the gap to Breece Hall being back and kind of up to speed. It's funny as you bring up the Saquon thing. It was also Kadarius Toney who stepped on Saquon. So Kadarius Toney just always wrecking everything.
Coming up everywhere.
Yeah, he's always, it's always Kadarius Toney, man. But one of the players that had an ACL injury as well, and you've kind of talked about this, it's when you're talking about Breece Hall having a relatively simple ACL, is, you hear ACL and we kind of treat them all the same. Javonte Williams did not have just an ACL tear, but we got the news that he's not going to open camp, at least on the PUP. So trending positively. One, just talk about first, like how different his injury is compared to Breece Hall's. And then like two, what we're kind of thinking about Javonte Williams from a top down stance.
Yeah, so good question and good observation that Javonte Williams' injury is not simple, right? It is more complicated. It is an ACL tear with what you would call either a posterolateral corner, which is just a general region, which probably involved the LCL, which is the sister of the MCL. It's just on the outside of the knee. So those are very specific, hyper-specific portions of the knee that just have players just have, they struggle to get back to the field on time after that injury. It's just more involved. These are the types of injuries that you can have a setback with. Look at somebody like J.K. Dobbins. Although I do want to point out, I think it's important to mention, J.K. Dobbins' injury was even worse than Javonte Williams's was, and we'll talk about him at some point. But Javonte Williams' injury is not necessarily straightforward. With Javonte Williams, it was surprising he didn't start on the PUP. I think that's a really, really good sign. I think that they're hoping that by week 1, when he'll be around 11 months, that he'll be close to what he is. But I mean, a lot of what ACL, injuries, a lot of it is for guys that are coming back, especially after a major one like this, is load management, right? Not necessarily in the sense of, are you going to be just, taking whole days off? But a lot of it is managing practice reps, right? Are you on the field on obvious passing downs if you're Javonte Williams? I don't know, because a lot of this is going to be based on how he's feeling, based on when he feels like he's explosive again. And, running backs with this type of injury and ACL plus, they don't have good outcomes, right? You think, and maybe not the best comparison, but Dion Lewis, right? Not he had a really relatively complicated injury, didn't turn out well. Rashod Penny, he had a complicated injury, did not turn out well. Obviously, you have somebody like J.K. Dobbins, did not turn out well. Gus Edwards, I think, is probably, even though stylistically and talent-wise, right, for a lot of reasons, isn't the best comp for Javonte Williams, but I think that he's probably the best comp from what you can maybe expect from Javonte Williams. Gus Edwards was around 83% of his pre-injury fantasy points per game on a PPR basis. I think that about an 80% Javonte Williams is reasonable, but you still have to deal with the risk of potentially having complications and setbacks with a potential scope right in the middle of the season. Like that's definitely on the table. And we just don't know what that's going to look like. And I think you can touch on the offense and Sean Payton and how he uses running backs, I'm sure. But they're just, he's in a better place than we thought he was a month ago. That's really, really good. But ultimately, he still comes in with a lot more risk than somebody like Breece Hall.
Yeah, he's been a tough guy to handle because obviously we've been clamoring about the upside of Javonte Williams, but injuries and production just haven't been there yet. So he still does take a leap of faith, multiple leaps of faith. Dobbins even was a guy that you brought up, was a guy that still required that step of faith too. Now Dobbins does open the camp on the PUP after he finished the season really strong. There are some whispers this might be a contract related, almost like a hold in some stance, but like we don't know until we get more information. Is there a concern that there could be more than just something contractually here?
I think that I really don't know at this point, right? Like there have been so many ups and downs, and I was literally just, as you were talking about, I pulled up what the team specifically said on Dobbins, and
Nothing.
they make it, they make it seem, well, so it's actually worse, right? So this is a specific quote from what they said specifically. They said Dobbins did not participate in minicamp as he continues to try to get back to 100% physically with his surgically repaired knee.
Okay.
It's been 23 months. Well, we don't necessarily expect that at 23 months. I think there's some rumblings that it is contract related. But I mean, at this point, what do you really want a guy who the team is saying is on? I mean, he's on the pup, right? Like bottom line, bare bones, maybe the team is willing to risk, some sort of penalty or fine from the league. But I mean, putting a guy on pup so that he doesn't take up a roster spot when he's not injured. I mean, that's a no-no. That's not something that you necessarily do if you're on the up and up. So even if it's something minor, in addition to the contract details, I just don't know. I don't know on J.K. Dobbins. Like I said, his knee basically exploded, and he was looking good, right? But at this point, we don't know if he's still having chronic lingering effects specifically. So as of right now, man, I'm really disappointed that I have to be, because I was actually looking forward to taking him this year, but I'm out on Dobbins specifically.
Yeah, he's a guy I haven't really been drafting either. Just where he goes and the profile of running back he is. I mean, he's an electric player, or was at least an electric player, and he did flash some of that last year too, towards the tail end of last year. But just the lack of receiving role, playing with a mobile quarterback, it's just all things that I want to try to arbitrage later out of maybe you guys like Rashod Penny and Khalil Herbert. I don't see like a functional difference for fantasy football on those guys, and they go way later, so they've just fit a lot of my builds a lot more than Dobbins has. We do have another ACL injury to talk about, and that's Kyler Murray. Kyler, a lot of people are leaving Kyler. Like, people are assuming this is just be a tank year for the Cardinals, and they're assuming that Kyler won't play. Are you buying any of that? Like, first of all, top down?
No, I'm not. I really am not.
Yeah.
So, and this is narrative-y, right? I try not to be the narrative guy because I'm trying to be the data guy and the stats guy. But this is like just real world experience. This isn't a flex either. Like, I've been around some elite level guys, and like, in the best way possible, I say this with love, they're the biggest egomaniacs that you will ever meet, right? Like, you talk to them and it's like, well, yeah, of course, like, we're losing right now. It's because I'm not playing, right? Or if I come back, like, I think I can really help the team. Like, in a way, that's really what's helped them get to the point that they're at, right? Like, they have to have some sort of ego. It's like Kyler Murray was the best football player in maybe Texas high school football history, right? Like, his head has been pumped with just everything up until he got to the NFL, right? What was the stat? Like, he hadn't lost a game or something until he got to college or something like that. Like, the dude has always been the best player on the field. He's been told that he's the best player on the field, and he thinks he's the best player on the field, right? And so for a guy that everybody's already packing, everybody's packing it in for him, like, I think some of that narrative is going to drive him to want to be back. And then, okay, so now let's move back to like the objective lens, right? Like, let's look at Carson Wentz, Deshaun Watson, Joe Burrow, even Donovan McNabb, even Robert Griffin III. Mm-hmm. Those are 5 quarterbacks who are the most relatively comparable to Kyler Murray. They all came back within 10 months. Robert Griffin III, he had an LCL. I think it was Carson Wentz. He had an LCL. and Joe Burrow's knee just imploded in on itself. He had everything. He came back in 9 months, right? Like at worst, I think so. From what it seems like, Kyler Murray had a small meniscus trim, and he had no other involvement. At worst, if this were a totally different situation, right? Let's say that he were the Chiefs, like let's say Kyler Murray were on the Chiefs and was a franchise quarterback there. I would all but guarantee he would be back by week 2 or week 3. So in this situation, maybe it's not, a mirror image exactly. Like we're talking physically here, right? Like he would physically be capable to return at that point. But I don't think this is a situation. I know I'm rambling at this point. Like, I don't think this is a situation where they're going to wait 6, 7, 8 weeks to bring it back. I think that's just patently absurd that we even believe as a group of fans that would fly with the player in his camp anyway, right? Because he looks at it. Kyler Murray's camp has to look at it as, I'm either going to go out there and earn trade value, right? Or I'm going to prove to this team that I'm the franchise guy and that I still got it. So, all right, I'll let you talk. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, that just echoes that. It's everything I wanted to hear, because I think it's just absolutely insane that people believe an athlete that would be capable of playing would openly be down with like a team saying, we're not going to play you, especially a guy that literally signed a $200 million contract the year prior. That like wouldn't come out, right? Like it wouldn't come forward. So I mean, I have a hard time believing that was even entertained. So when are you kind of thinking like that Kyler will be back? And then the second follow-up to that question is this, we talked about play style maybe not mattering for injury, but Kyler's particular play style and how he scores fantasy points has been through mobility. And it definitely was last year. When you look at last year, he was 17th in EPA per drop back. He really struggled, as a passer. He took a step back as a passer, but he was still QB9 in points per game because of the mobility factor and the rushing. Even if he comes back, we have to anticipate that that's compromised, right?
Yeah, I read an article once from some guy that wrote it some time ago. I don't remember his name or where he wrote it from or where that article came from. But basically, the moral of the story was that rushing quarterbacks are good. Have you read that article? I'm not sure if you read that article.
Unfortunately, it's going to be 10 years since that article came out this September, which is wild.
That is wild. That's actually wild. But man, that has aged extremely well. Like fine wine. That entire
it's all
entire
I've got.
study.
It's all I'm hanging on to.
Nah, it's not true. So yes. So this is exactly like, this is why you're one of the sharp ones, Reeves, because you don't look at narrative-y type stuff and anticipate X, Y, or Z. Like you're looking at the specific of Kyler Murray. So if there is a knock on Kyler Murray or some concern, it would be from rushing, right? Because you look at those 5 quarterbacks that I mentioned earlier, and there was a drop of about 19% in rushing yards for those guys. For some weird reason, Deshaun Watson ran for his life, and he actually increased his rushing attempts by like 20% or something like that. But the other 4, if you average those out, their rushing attempts drop by about 20% in their first year back from an ACL. In addition to that, you also hear rumblings that they're probably going to be a lot more under center on an offense. I'll let you touch on that a little bit more, just on play calling and stuff like that. But Kyler Murray does also have a history of a hamstring strain. He had a hamstring strain in 2019, and then he had a hamstring strain again just last year. And he missed, and I'm relatively certain it was either 21 or 22. He missed time for it. Those things don't necessarily go away unless they work on them specifically. So if he ramps up too quickly, or if he just ramps up, that's a part of his history that he needs to deal with from a rushing perspective. And when he plays, so this is a tweet that I put out like a year ago at this point. So in 2019, Kyler Murray, in games that he's not listed with the hamstring strain, he averaged 7 rushes for 37 yards. And again, small sample, but we'll take it for what it's worth. In the 2 games listed on the report with a hamstring strain, Kyler Murray saw 3 rushes, 14 yards. And in one of those games, he had 0 rushing yards, right? So this is something that isn't, abstract. This hamstring thing could be something that we're dealing with from a Kyler Murray perspective. So if you're going to fade Kyler, which I don't even necessarily think this is like a big enough issue to fade him fully for, especially at his current ADP. But if you're going to have some sort of concern from him, I do think it's what you mentioned. It's the rushing and it's the hamstring.
Yeah. You look at the Cardinals, there's going to be a big shift in offensive approach, obviously losing Cliff Kingsbury and, the air raid, the 4 wide receiver stuff. I mean, really, the Cardinals last year were the only team in the NFL that still even used 4 wide receivers. It was an all-time low of the past decade for 4 wide receiver sets in the NFL. And it was literally 80% of that was just the Cardinals last year. That's going to be reined in. Their new offensive coordinator, Drew Petzing's actually worked the last 3 years with Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland. He was with the Vikings prior to that. So it's going to be a lot more of that play action under center, kind of offense. They're going to be a lot slower. So it is going to be a big culture shift for Arizona. It's not going to be like last year. And, even I've kind of quoted some of the splits like Hollywood Brown splits with without Kyler and with and without DeAndre Hopkins. But you have to remember too, that the Cardinals throughout that period, and this is actually prevalent too for DeAndre Hopkins when people are talking about his stats now, because he just signed and it was just in the news, that the Cardinals are running the most routes in the NFL. Obviously they had jailbreak game scripts, and then the style of offense they were playing just led to like this flood of opportunity for just guys being on the field for pass routes. Hollywood Brown, those first 6 weeks, led the NFL in pass routes run. When DeAndre Hopkins was, performing from a raw calculated stance, it was through sheer volume of routes. He actually averaged a career low yards per catch last year. If the routes come way down, it stands out a lot more. It's different when you're able to circumvent that and you're catching 7 or 8 passes a game because you're running, 45 to 50 pass routes a game. If you're running 25 to 35 pass routes a game, that ends up looking a lot different in terms of that outcome. So yeah, the Cardinals definitely in a case. I've been avoiding Kyler 1 quarterback leagues because I just don't see the risk with 1 quarterbacks. 2 quarterback leagues, there's probably a little more nuance to the equation. If you're in 2 quarterback leagues, are you suggesting, are you looking at Kyler, or is he going to be a void for you?
No, I definitely think, depending on the draft room that you're in, that I think you could swing Kyler as your QB. I mean, again, depends on the draft room. QB3. If you do something like, I don't know, like I did in Scott Fishbowl, for example, I went Lamar Jackson, swung back through, and got, I want to say it was Brock Purdy. And then I was almost able to get Kyler Murray, right? So like, it's totally possible that you can have a build that looks something like that. And not necessarily suggesting it, but I'm probably going to take more field. It's just a matter of how much overweight I want to be, because I do think that there is some untapped upside just based on his ADP purely, even if the ceiling is capped this year.
Nice. Yeah, you brought up Brock Purdy, so let's talk about Brock Purdy. I did talk about a little bit when we lost you for a little bit. Looks like he's even ahead of maybe the original timeline from the elbow surgery. One, kind of just talk about his injury because it's one that's not overly like common. I guess maybe it is. Maybe I'm wrong on that point. Just even making that kind of commentary, because we saw Josh Elbow an elbow injury too last year. But I don't remember this being like more of like a quarterback injury. I feel like it should be more of a quarterback injury. Like you could kind of associate it to like pitchers in baseball, but like not a lot. Like we had Stafford last year, but talk about Brock Purdy, because Kyle Shanahan's already come out and said that he earned the right to open as a QB1. I think that's totally tracks. He should be. But is there any concern that maybe he still is either behind, or is this like great green lights, like just go for it?
Yeah, I don't think that this is necessarily abnormal. It is fast. I'll definitely say that it is fast. So real quick, I'll try to be brief on this. So this is my world, right? Like the elbow shoulder is like my entire world right now. So I've seen like a ton of Tommy Johns. So the Tommy John ligament, the ligament inside the elbow, that ligament essentially stabilizes the elbow. And when you tear it in a specific location on the ligament itself, you really can't rehab it. Especially if you're going to be a pitcher, you just have to unfortunately reconstruct it. There's a big reconstruction where you redo the whole thing. And that's the Tommy John surgery, right? These days you can come back 12 to 15 months. It used to be like 2 years, right? There's another surgery that is less severe. And this is a surgery that takes, pitchers still takes them 6 to 9 months to return. It's just the repair. They use your native tissue, they reinforce it, they pin it back down, they suture it, they close you up, and you're done. It's not a big reconstruction. So when it comes to pitchers in particular, you can come back in 6 to 9 months. Now, there's a big difference in pitchers and quarterbacks. And that's the reason that Brock Purdy is already back. He's probably still working through his throwing program, and they probably just programmed his throwing into what they're going to do in camp anyway, because it's, not live. So the reason pitchers take so long to come back is because you have to build volume and you have to build intensity. Throwing a baseball, right? A small baseball, 90, anywhere from 88 to 95 miles per hour on average, puts the most torque on the elbow that we know on a human elbow, like the most torque that you could possibly imagine. And they're doing that, right? Depending on if they're, reliever or starter, 20, 30, 40 times every time there's an outing, right? If a quarterback throws 40 times in a game, that's like an enormous amount of passing volume. So just based on that, and the throwing motion for quarterbacks, we also know based on biomechanical studies, is not as intense as it is for pitchers. Now I got extremely lost in the weeds. I mentioned biomechanical studies. I'll bring it back to fantasy football. Moral of the story: this is not an abnormal timeline. I think it is a little fast, but I don't think we should necessarily be disappointed or have any red flags up for Brock Purdy. I do think this is par for the course because quarterbacks can't come back from this injury. And since it wasn't as severe, I don't necessarily see any setbacks. There's no real sample to compare. So it's not as common in quarterbacks. There's no real good sample to compare it. Yeah, no, you're fine.
I think it dunked on with that.
No. It's like Jake Delhomme had TJ, Nick Mullins. The sample's not good to begin with, but I will be interested to see what his adjusted, passer rating is and his adjusted completion percentage and stuff like that, and see how he throws in tight windows. So I would ask you, how did he throw in tight windows when he was healthy?
Yeah, Purdy's an interesting guy from a number of levels. I talked a little bit about it while we lost to you. It's just, one, we have a super small sample size of him, playing last year. Two, we've seen fleeting moments from these guys before in this particular system. You think about Brian Hoyer, Nick Mullins, who you brought up, CJ Beathard, and I mean, even Garoppolo, right? Like guys where the talent level is maybe questionable through the results that we're getting from the system. And in particular, how just this offensive system shreds bad defenses, right? Like functional quarterback play in this system just decimates bad defenses. And Purdy faced just a ton of bad defenses when he started. I don't think it's a coincidence that the one good defense he faced, the Cowboys, they looked mortal. And, they probably lose that game at least probably 5 of the 10 times, half if they will play that game again. And they have those same results, right? Like the Cowboys have a second half turnover. It's still a close game. And when you look at Purdy, like I said, when he was pressured last year, his completion rate went from 74% when he was kept clean to 47.7% when he's pressured. It went from 4th to 24th. His inaccurate rate went from 7% kept clean to 22% when pressured. It went from 8th to 43rd. So there are still questions here that maybe we're not out of the complete weeds, even though the health is obviously trending in the positive direction. Is there end up being a shorter leash? Do we see Trey Lance? Do we see Sam Darnold? There's a lot more things in play here than just Purdy being healthy. I don't necessarily think that makes him a slam dunk fantasy pick, but it's definitely the first step in trending positively. One guy that's not trending positively, and that is Rashod Bateman. And I love Rashod Bateman as a prospect. I mean, I thought he was comparable from a talent perspective to Justin Jefferson. I thought coming out, I'm like, this guy does all the things Justin Jefferson did good, and why I really love Justin Jefferson. And we've had some fleeting samples of Bateman both years in the NFL that this dude can ball, but he hasn't been able to stay healthy. We now have the Liz Frank. I believe he had you call it hardware. I think he had a screw removed from his foot.
Mm-hmm.
In this
I call it hardware. Oh, nobody else calls it hardware.
I mean,
time out.
People in your profession.
You need to revoke your dad card. Do not tell me that I call it hardware. A screw is, whether it's in the medical world or if it's on a shelf. It is a screw is a screw, my friend.
It is. You would get a screw at a hardware store, so I believe it. But but he has the hardware removed from his foot. And now he's also opening camp on the PUP. A guy we want to be excited about, but is this something that maybe I'm getting overly cautious on, or is this a big thing?
I think it's somewhere in the middle. So I don't want to say full sail ahead, full steam ahead. We're all good on Bateman. This should be fine, and it's in the past. But I do think that it's probably not that big of a deal, and his ADP's already probably baked it in. So it's not abnormal to have hardware removed from your foot. It's not abnormal to get a cortisone shot afterwards. What you do, it just depends on when, right? So Marquise Brown, who actually ironically played for the Ravens as well, he didn't have his screw removed until the offseason because it was probably bothering him. And Rashod Bateman, just the team decided like, hey, this irritation you're having probably coming from the screw. Let's go ahead and take it out. That's not uncommon. Could you call it a setback? Technically. But do we expect him to still be ready by week 1? Yeah, he'll be ready by week 1. So there's actually some interesting data on Liz Frank, but it's really not as prominent, or it's not as, I don't want to call it like trustworthy, I guess, because they use a really weird formula that includes like quarterback touchdowns. They try to count the study that they did. It was a noble job. They did their best. They tried to count basically production for every offensive player. And so they found like a 20% reduction dip. And I've even quoted that article before, a 20% production dip, but it's a really imperfect way to look at it. But then, so if you even try to dive deeper though, I mean, our Liz Frank crew is just not really a good comparable group, right? Because you have Alshon Jeffrey, he was, 30 years old. Santonio Holmes, I mean, he played one more season and then he was out of the league. You have Marquise Brown, who was a rookie at the time, and so he did improve the following year, but that was probably just based on being a rookie. And then there's another guy that I'm missing. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but the sample's tiny. It's like 4 or 5 guys. It's guys like Preston Williams and Philip Dorsett. Like, we can't really draw conclusions from there. What I can tell you is after any surgery, there is chance of re-injury. And what I can tell you is that so far, it doesn't seem like his rehab has gone 100% smoothly. But like I said, for me personally, based on the last time I looked at his ADP, I'm totally fine with that. Like, I am willing to take a flyer on Rashod Bateman, and I don't necessarily think that this foot issue is going to linger and follow him around. Maybe what we see in 2024 is like a resurgence and like a true breakout, but I do think that Bateman can provide some legitimate for people if they're scared off the injury behind him. That injury a lot of receivers and tight ends have had, and there's good success rates on that surgery for it to not occur again. I think the most recent guy was Alan Lazard. He had that. It was never an issue again. So I wouldn't worry so much about the groin moving forward. So I think that it's somewhere in the middle. I don't think he's going to bust and just like have a catastrophic end of the season again. But I don't necessarily think he's going to hit his ceiling, but I don't think he necessarily has to given his ADP right now.
Yeah, we've seen the last week, especially when this news kind of came out. He's dipped a wide receiver 46, actually below his teammate first round pick. Zay Flowers is now going ahead of him. So if you are going to be on the more optimistic side, this is the time. Like the price is bottomed out for sure since camp opened, and you can kind of, like I said, play on a lot of this stuff early in drafts, especially if you're someone doing these underdogs and these best ball drafts. You're playing an FFPC. Use some of the news because it's going to impact ADP always. It's going to be nebulous. Since we lost you for 10 minutes, I'm going to keep you a little bit over here. We got some other guys that are kind of floating around off injury that maybe are under the radar. Tony Pollard, Cooper Kupp, Jonathan Taylor had offseason surgery. Kyle Pitts is not on the PUP. We saw him with a knee brace on. Are there any concern with any of those guys?
So usually this is a section. I've been doing this 5 years now. Usually this is a section where like these names and the news up to this point, you're like, oh yeah, all full steam ahead. No issues here. It's been interesting. Right. So I'll get it. But for people that are holding their breath on Tony Pollard, he's going to be fine. He had tightrope and he had a high ankle. We've looked at this is, again, everything I'm saying is in this book, by the way. What we saw in running backs it's about 10 running backs, relatively small sample, but we got what we got. We've seen about an 89% dip, or I'm sorry, a 10% dip, not 89, it's 10 to 11% dip in production average after a fibula fracture, which is what Tony Pollard had. But the median is 102, which means the tail ends, there were tail ends, like some guy was like 17% and then another guy was like 29%. But generally speaking, coming back from these injuries for a young guy like Tony Pollard, not going to be an issue. You do have I'm going to call it very specifically minimal to moderate re-injury risk, because he also has had the plantar fascia issue that almost completely tore off his foot. So he doesn't come, scot-free. He does have an injury history himself, but I do think that from the fibula fracture itself, he's going to be fine. What I will say is Cooper Kupp, same thing. I mean, Cooper Kupp's going to come back from the high ankle sprain. People are going to discount him. I think that he has maybe not the same, chances to finish as a wide receiver one as Justin Jefferson or somebody like Jamar Chase. But I don't think that the drop off is as big as, that people realize. He's probably going to be fine as well. Jonathan Taylor and Kyle Pitts. I'll be 100% honest with you and transparent. Up until today, I really thought Kyle Pitts was fine. And then I really thought Jonathan Taylor was fine. Jonathan Taylor, we wouldn't necessarily expect him to be on the PUP after the procedures that he had, unless it was a bigger procedure than I understood, which to me, I thought it was just, hey, let's shave these bone spurs out, close you back up, no big deal. I think it's interesting that he's on the PUP. It probably will end up being nothing, but I don't have a ton on him because there just hasn't been a lot of reporting on him. Kyle Pitts, we assumed that he had just an MCL sprain, but now that I'm watching him run and we're watching the fact that he didn't start on PUP. So again, this is kind of backwards. You'd expect these two guys to be reversed. You'd expect JT to be fine, Kyle Pitts not to start on PUP. Kyle Pitts instead doesn't start on PUP, but still has this bulky knee brace on. You watch the hit that he took. And I could send it to you. So I'll try to find it and send it to you. The hit that he took definitely implicates that that he had probably some more involvement and potentially some PCL or meniscus, either or. So that does complicate it, relatively speaking. And he's not just like a slam dunk. Like I thought he was going to be like, oh yeah, Kyle Pitts slam dunk. But if he also is coming off last year, he had the hamstring strain too. So he's not necessarily like the ideal perfect picture of health coming into the season. And I think it might take him, 3, 4, 5 weeks to really get ramped up. And his re-injury risk is, higher than Andrews, higher than Kelsey, higher than Hawkinson at this point. So he's not a guy that I'm necessarily targeting right now. But again, I'll have more on that moving forward because I still think I need to dig in a little bit more.
All right, so let's move on here. So are there any players that kind of we talk about being removed from injury, and you brought up a couple guys earlier. Are there any guys that were injured last year that maybe you necessarily were cautious on, but now this season you feel like the market has overcorrected on maybe either their performance, didn't factor that in, and now you're just saying like, yeah, I'm all in on this guy?
Man, the answer was going to be slam dunk J.K. Dobbins. Like I was just going to slam dunk J.K. Dobbins, and now we have all the issues that have come up with him. So, and this is a hard question, really. So I do want to say Jameson Williams. For the Dynasty Bros, he's going to fall out of all their models, but it's the situation and the circumstances are so extraneous that I don't think he necessarily should. My biggest piece of evidence is that I played Madden with him, and I created a player. And I could just throw fades all day and nobody could stop him. So that's really my prime. I'm just kidding. That's not the only reason. But really, like Jameson Williams, I think he can be a player, obviously gets suspended the 6 games. But I don't think that the ACL even let him fully unleash what he can do. And so I think people are sleeping on him a little bit. The suspension's obviously not great. And then I think Lamar Jackson. Like I stacked in Scott Fishbowl, Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews, and I was blessed. I was shocked. I didn't know I could do it. So I think that in general, I don't know where you stand totally. I've heard bits and pieces of where you stand on the Monken offense and the Ravens specifically. But I do think that people are sleeping on Lamar Jackson a little bit because of the injury, and obviously because there's a little bit of unknown there with the offense. So those would be the guys that I give.
I mean, I've been clamoring and pounding the table for Jameson Williams. You look at how great last year's draft class was of wide receivers, and there were people that had Jameson Williams as their wide receiver one, like people in the know, like Daniel Jeremiah. You think about like what guys like Chris Olave did. That's a class with Garrett Wilson and Drake London, right? Like, so for Williams as a talent to be perceived in that kind of group, and obviously he played at Ohio State with a couple of those guys before he went to Alabama, and what he's going to be walking into, right? I love that the suspension has like moved his ADP because historically suspended players end up undervalued anyways because people don't know how to properly inflect replacement value into their lineups. If you look at a history of all guys that have been suspended, I mean, so many of them have been just smashes at ADP. So the fact that now maybe where he would have been coming off of the injury and you had to draft him as like, say, like a top 30 wide receiver, now we're able to get him as a wide receiver flex, a bench play, and just have him come into our lineups and come back into this Detroit situation where we know the targets are available. I mean, they've still it's Marvin Jones, it's Josh Reynolds, it's Khalif Raymond. It's the opportunities there. It's an offense we want access to. Everyone loves Ben Johnson. It's an indoor team. It's everything, man. And I'm just taking this discount on this talent, and I'm trying to get as much, Jameson Williams as I can. I've been pounding the table on the Ravens too of being good. I put out a whole team regression series on the site last week, and Ravens are one of the teams that consistently popped as due for like a bunch of offensive regression, positive regression towards the mean. I know people hate when they.
I'm sorry, I haven't read that.
Yeah,
I will read.
I know people hate when you say like regression is like or positive regression. People hate that phrase, but it is what it is, and it exists. I'll get you out of here on one last one. It's kind of the inverse of what we talked about. Your book definitely talks about like how the misnomer of injury, the injury prone, how it's commonly referred to as a misnomer. But there are these players that have kind of a track record of injuries that may be chronic, right? Like, and is there anyone that has a history of injuries that you definitely stock and concern you more than maybe the public is letting on right now?
Yeah. And I don't know if necessarily the public isn't aware of these guys, but obviously Kadarius Toney. I mean,
everyone's aware of Kadarius Toney.
Everyone's aware. Everyone's aware of the Kadarius Toney thing. But like, I'm obviously like injury prone as a lie, optimistic guy, and I'm out on Toney this year. I just am. His hamstrings can't stay put. His quads can't stay put. He had an oblique strain at one point. This is his second arthroscopic procedure to help fix his meniscus. Like, that can be a disaster. Like, I'm just out on Kadarius Toney. Another guy that I'm extremely cautious on this year is Keenan Allen. The guy has had, this history of hamstring strains over the last couple of years. And I really think that it's difficult to analyze him because I think he's either 30 or 31. He's either going into his 30 or 31-year-old season. And injuries like hamstrings just don't go away when you're that old. They can, right? But unfortunately, a lot of them fall into like the Julio Jones, where he just couldn't stay on the field because of the hamstring issue the last couple of years of his career. I say that like he retires. I don't think he's officially retired. But I mean, I just worry that he's not going to be able to totally hold up from like the hamstring perspective. And then another guy's, again, Darren Waller, who same thing, soft tissue injuries. Soft tissue injuries have the highest recurrence rate of all injuries that I track that are going to be in this book. They have a 34% year-to-year recurrence rate, and that's over a span of 5 years. So it's really tough. I really don't know where to place these guys in particular. And I think I'm a little more leery of those guys right now. And I wish that I could think of more. I can't think of more off the top of my head, but those are the three that I'm thinking.
I think those are really good. And I think when you are factoring in risk, you want to think of like the structure of your team, right? Because you look at Keenan Allen when he played last year, he was very strong. But, if you're taking Keenan Allen to be your wide receiver too, it's a lot different than taking him as your third wide receiver, right? In scenarios like that. So you want to be cognizant of, factoring that risk in based on the structure of your team to that point, and kind of the upside would be. Now, Darren Waller is kind of a no man's land because it's a onesie position. Like if you're taking Darren Waller at ADP, you're probably not taking another tight end during your draft. So that one's going to be more of a, kind of an all or nothing swing. But yeah, Kadarius Toney, I mean, the hopium, I don't know. And we talked about play style kind of not mattering, but like when you watch Kadarius Toney, like human bodies aren't supposed to move like that, right? Like I feel like he kind
of, he could be an exception.
Like, I watch him, I'm like no wonder why this guy's always hurt. Like he's like, one doesn't even have bones. Like what does he do? Like, yeah, that's why I always feel like he's hurt. But those are great names though. That's great, man. We fought through it. I fumbled my way through about 8 to 10 minutes when we lost you. I had no idea what to do. I've never been placed in that situation. It was like if you ever seen the movie Major League, when Bob Uecker like passes out and Monty's the color guy and he's like trying to carry the game. That's exactly what happened in podcast form.
Well, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry about that. Did you feel like Chad Henne when Patrick Mahomes went down?
Yeah, no, man. Chad Henne balled, man. Chad Henne was instrumental in 2 Chiefs playoff wins. They can never take that away. But listen, I appreciate you taking the time. You're someone that I always love to have on because you add perspective to an area that was necessary in fantasy football. You just had guys like me talking about injured players, and someone would ask us a question and we would do our best guesswork with no educational background. I can tell you about a lot of things football related, and I can tell you a lot of things about playing fantasy football with a lot of data behind them, but I'm not a medical professional and I have no medical experience. So now that we have, people like you coming into the space and finding a niche, it's just making our game that much better and the content that much stronger. So I'm very grateful for you. Let everyone know again the project that you're working on and kind of where they can find this.
Well, very kind words, Reeves. Very kind words. I appreciate that. And obviously, I love all your work. I love everything you do as well. I love kicking your ass in our league. Sorry, I don't know if I can cuss.
You can.
I'm
you
sorry.
Can do whatever you want.
Okay. I love kicking your ass in the league that we're in, the injury prone league. But I really do appreciate those nice kind words. Again, just follow me on Twitter at FBInjuryDoc. That's where you can find everything you need. The pre-sale link is updated in the show sheet. If you guys want to drop it in there, I did give the 25% off Sharp25. Use promo code Sharp25 to pre-order the injury prone draft guide and playbook. Again, it'll have everything you need to guide you through the season, all the major injuries. It'll give you a first week back, the median, the average fantasy points, the whatever you want to know, like the routes run for receivers, the touches for running backs. It'll give you just about everything you need to know to make an educated decision on start sits. So yeah, that's it, man. I really appreciate you having me on. This is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And a little housekeeping at the Sharp Football website. As you guys know, the draft kit that myself, Raymond Summerlin, Todd Burrows have all put together, that's still available on the site. You can find, discount to get that for just $1 through an Underdog affiliate if you want to go that route. Also, Warren Sharp's 2023 team preview book, still on sale. So you can grab that too as well. Literally the most informative, in-depth, football book that you can grab to preview the 2023 season. For Edwin, I'm Rich at Lord Reeves. You can catch us next week. I'll have another guest. Ray won't be back, but good luck, everybody.